A woman abandoned by the town. Widow, penniless, unwanted by everyone. A disabled man considered socially dead, sitting in the shadows of a crumbling farm. They married not for love, but because they had no other choice. But behind that desperate marriage lies a sordid conspiracy that has suffocated the community for years. And the most dangerous one is the man smiling at them every day. Like this post to support the channel and comment the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has progressed. Don't miss it. Watch until the end. The morning Elena Mercer signed her name to a marriage contract she hadn't written and hadn't wanted, the sky over Callaway Flats was the color of dirty dishwater. Not dramatic, not threatening, just gray and tired and indifferent, the way the sky got when it had seen too many bad days to bother with commentary. She stood at the kitchen table in the boarding house. What passed for a kitchen, anyway, since Mrs. Platt's stove ran cold half the time and the floorboards near the window had been soft for a year, and she read the document twice. Not because she was uncertain. She was certain. She was as certain as she'd ever been about anything, which was precisely what made her stomach drop. This was real. This was happening. In 48 hours, she would be Elena Cross, wife of a man she had spoken to exactly once, and that conversation had lasted under 10 minutes and consisted mostly of silence. She set the pen down and pressed both palms flat against the table, her reflection caught in the dark window glass. She didn't look away from it, though part of her wanted to. She had learned early that looking away from things didn't make them smaller. It just meant you were surprised later. The woman in the glass was 34 years old. She was wider than the dresses at Harmon's General Store were cut to accommodate. Her dark hair was pinned badly. She'd never had the patience for it, and Thomas had always done it better than she had, which was embarrassing to admit even to herself, especially now. Her face was plain and a little sunburned, and the circles under her eyes had not left in 6 weeks, which was how long Thomas had been in the ground. 6 weeks. She picked the pen back up and signed. Thomas Mercer had not been a bad man. That was what she kept coming back to, in the quiet of nights at the boarding house, with Mrs. Platt's other boarder, old Clifton, who smelled of pipe smoke and horse, coughing through the wall. Thomas hadn't been a bad man. He had been a careless one. There was a difference, though the distinction felt thin when you were the person left behind to manage the consequences. He had borrowed against the farm. She hadn't known how much until after the funeral, when Reeves from the bank rode out with his hat in his hand and his apology worn smooth from use, the way a phrase gets when it's been said so many times it stops meaning anything. The farm was leveraged nearly to nothing, he told her. The equipment, the land, the livestock that had survived the dry summer, which hadn't been many. Thomas had been managing something, apparently, that she hadn't been brought into, keeping something afloat. She didn't know what. She probably never would. She was given 2 weeks to vacate. She vacated in 1 because standing in the empty rooms was worse than leaving them. She had moved into the boarding house with $47 and 2 trunks, one of dresses that didn't quite fit anymore, one of the things she hadn't been willing to sell, which was a short list, a quilt her mother had made, Thomas's watch, because his sister Dora lived in Cincinnati and Elena didn't have the fare to send it, a Bible she never opened, 3 books, a photograph of no one in particular, just a traveling photographer who'd set up on the main street years ago and offered a free portrait with any purchase, and she'd bought a spool of thread she hadn't needed. Callaway Flats had roughly 300 people, which was large enough to have opinions and small enough for everyone to know yours. Elena had lived there for 9 years, most of her marriage. She had thought she belonged to the place, the way you do when you've buried someone you loved in its soil. Turns out belonging is not a thing that transfers through grief. Within 2 weeks of Thomas's death, the women who had been her neighbors, not friends exactly, but close enough to feel like an approximation, had quietly made themselves unavailable. Not unkind, just absent. The way people got when widowhood made them think too clearly about their own precarious arrangements. Mrs. Platt told her directly what everyone else was performing ignorance about. "You need to find a situation," Mrs. Platt said. She was washing a pot and not looking at Elena, which was either tact or cowardice. $47 won't carry you 6 months. There's not enough work here for a woman alone, and the town's not going to—" She stopped, scrubbed harder at the pot. You're not young. You're not. Another stop. You need to be practical. Elena had sat at that table and stared at the grain of the wood and thought, I know all of this. I have known all of this for weeks, and I have been lying in the dark every night cataloging it, and I do not need you to list it for me. What she said was, what situation did you have in mind? The situation Mrs. Platt had in mind was Gideon Cross. Most people in Callaway Flats had heard of the Cross Ranch the way you heard of a landmark that had seen better days. You knew where it was, you knew it had once been something, and you mostly didn't think about it unless it was relevant to your own concerns. The ranch sat 8 miles east of town, which was far enough to be inconvenient and close enough that the gossip about it arrived fresh. Gideon Cross was 39. He had run the ranch alone for going on 6 years since his father died and left him the property and the debts that came with it. He had been, by most accounts, competent, self-sufficient. The kind of man who doesn't need much from a town, and the town doesn't need much from him, and both parties are content with the arrangement. Then about a year ago, 14 months to be precise, though Elena didn't learn this detail until later, he had been thrown from his horse, or that was the version that circulated. The fall had damaged something in his lower back and leg. He had come into town twice after that, once on a wagon, and once on a horse he couldn't fully control, and both times he had looked bad. Not dying bad, but the kind of bad that settled in a man's face when the pain had become ordinary. He ran the ranch now with 2 hired hands who lived on the property, a man named Walt and his nephew Dix. He had not been seen in town in 4 months. He needed a wife. It was understood, the way a man in that position needed most things, not because he wanted one, but because the practical management of a working property required a woman's labor, and he could no longer provide a significant portion of his own. The word had circulated quietly, the way things did in Callaway Flats, and it had come eventually to Mrs. Platt, and from Mrs. Platt to Elena. He's not asking for love, Mrs. Platt said, still washing the pot, which by this point must have been the cleanest pot in the territory. He's asking for help, and you need a roof. It's a reasonable thing. Elena had asked who had approached whom. Mrs. Platt hesitated slightly. His solicitor. He hired a solicitor for this. It seemed he wanted to do it properly. Elena had looked at the grain of the wood for a long time. Set up the meeting, she said. Well, the meeting happened in the front room of the solicitor's office, which smelled like old paper and was cold because the wood in the stove was damp. The solicitor, a narrow man named Fry with excellent posture and the demeanor of someone who had heard every embarrassing human arrangement and maintained impartiality through sheer professional discipline, sat at his desk and said nothing that wasn't necessary. Gideon Cross sat across from Elena in a hard chair. He had a cane propped against the armrest. He was not what she had expected, though she couldn't have said what she'd expected. Something more visibly ruined, maybe, or more visibly bitter. He was tall, even sitting. His hair was dark and going silver at the temples, and he had the kind of face that had spent years outdoors and showed it, all weathered lines and squinted-in eyes that watched her steadily without any particular expression. He looked tired, not beaten. Just tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for too long and has stopped hoping it will get lighter. She noticed, because she was a person who noticed things, that his left hand rested on his knee in a position that looked deliberate, not comfortable, deliberate. He was managing something about his posture, something that cost him small effort, but continuous effort. He didn't speak first. She didn't speak first. Mr. Fry read the terms of the proposed arrangement in a brisk, neutral voice, and when he was done, there was silence. Do you have questions? Gideon Cross said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Not warm, exactly, but not hostile. Careful, maybe, like someone who had decided words were worth measuring before release. Is the ranch solvent? Elena said. Something moved through his eyes. Not surprise. More like reassessment. It operates, he said. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. It's not. The ranch carries debt. I won't pretend otherwise, if that's a condition for you. I'm a widow with $47, Elena said. I'm not in a position to have conditions about debt. Another pause. He studied her face in the way of someone trying to determine whether what they were seeing was genuine or performance. Then what is your condition? He said. She had thought about this. Honesty. Whatever's going on that ranch, I want to know it. I'm not asking to run it. I'm asking not to be kept in the dark about things that affect me. Gideon Cross looked at Mr. Fry for a moment, then back at her. Something had shifted slightly in his expression. She couldn't read it completely. Agreed, he said. And your condition, she said. That you stay, he said. Not because you're obligated, because you decide to. He said it simply, without sentiment, the way you stated a fact about terrain. The last year has been, I need someone who isn't going to leave at the first difficulty. There's been enough of that. Elena thought about the boarding house, about Mrs. Platt's too clean pot, about $47. All right, she said. That was the whole of it. Mr. Fry produced the document. They both signed. It took less time than it should have, Elena thought, for something that was going to change the shape of her life. The wagon that carried her to the ranch 2 days later was driven by the nephew, Dix, 19 years old, sun-darkened, with the look of someone who had grown up doing hard work and found it agreeable enough. He didn't say much beyond what was useful, which Elena appreciated. She sat in the wagon bed with her 2 trunks and watched Callaway Flats get smaller behind her. She didn't feel sad about leaving. She felt something more neutral than that. There was a word for it she couldn't quite locate. Not relief, not dread. Something between them. The feeling of having committed to a direction you're not sure of, but at least you're moving. The ranch appeared after a long approach across flat, dry land. The kind of landscape that had ambitions toward beauty and spring, but was currently just brown and utilitarian. The main house was bigger than she'd expected, 2 stories with a covered porch built by someone with intentions. It needed paint in several places, and one of the porch boards was visibly soft, and the fence line to the west had been partially repaired with wire that didn't match the original work, the improvised kind of fix you made when you'd run out of the better option. But the structure itself was sound. She could see that. She could see other things, too. The barn needed work. The door hinge on the left side was bent out from the frame. One of the paddock posts had cracked and been braced with a second post lashed alongside it. A small outbuilding behind the house, which looked like it had been used for storage, had a window with a piece of oilcloth over it rather than glass. Small things. Individual, they meant nothing. Together, they told you something about the last year, about a man who had been doing what he could and coming up short on some of it. Dix brought the wagon to the front of the house and helped her down with her trunks without comment. Gideon Cross was on the porch. He had the cane, and he was standing with it, which looked like it took more effort than standing usually should. He watched her approach without expression. You made it, he said. I said I would. He looked at the trunks. Walt can take those up. There's a room. He stopped. I put you in the room at the east end of the hall. It gets morning light. The bed's new. He said it without inflection, but she had the sense it was the closest he came to saying he had tried to make something decent for her. Thank you, she said. He nodded. I'll show you the house. He turned and she followed him inside, watching without staring as he navigated the door with the cane. The slight adjustment of his weight, the pause before the threshold, the way he moved through it at an angle that minimized whatever the left side was doing. He was practiced at managing it. He had been managing it for over a year, but it was not easy. It was never easy. She didn't comment. She followed him through the house and asked practical questions about where things were and what needed doing, and he answered them in his careful, measured way, and neither of them pretended this was anything it wasn't. The first week was the longest of Elena's life, and also, in its strange way, the most clarifying. The work was not unfamiliar. She had run a farm household for 9 years, and the Cross Ranch, whatever its current troubles, ran on the same basic demands. She cooked on a better stove than she'd had at the boarding house. She managed the stores with the efficiency of someone who had learned to think in terms of what could be stretched. She mended what needed mending. She found her way around the kitchen in the particular way you do in a strange house, through trial and adjustment, putting things where they needed to be and quietly reorganizing what made no sense. Walt was 50-something, broad and unhurried, with a face like a walnut. He was cautious around her in the first days, politely so, the way men got when they weren't sure what authority a new woman was bringing in. She didn't assert any. She just did what needed doing, and by the fourth day he had stopped watching her sideways and started leaving the boot scraper by the back door the way she'd asked. Dick's was easier. He was 19, he was hungry often, and grateful for food, and that made him tractable. Gideon she barely saw in the first week. He worked outside in the mornings, or tried to. She could see him from the kitchen window, moving across the yard, the cane making his gait lopsided and deliberate. He came in for meals and ate without complaint, and said thank you in a way that meant it, and then left. He didn't linger. He didn't make small talk. She didn't push for it. She understood, in the way you understood things you'd felt yourself, something about what it was to be in a condition that required you to manage your own body moment to moment. She had never had Gideon's particular injury, but she had spent years in a body that the world treated as a failing. Too much of this, not enough of that, never quite right for someone else's idea of proper. You learn to armor yourself. You learn to take up as little space as possible in certain rooms, because taking up space meant being seen, and being seen meant judgment, and judgment was exhausting. You learned that silence was sometimes just maintenance. She didn't try to breach his silence. She just held up her end of what needed doing and waited. It was on the 9th day that she noticed the ledgers. She had been looking for the household accounts. Nothing sinister in the looking, just practical management, the kind of thing you needed to understand what you could order and what you could defer and what was already overdue. Gideon had said, during their walkthrough of the house, that the accounts were in the desk drawer in the front room. She had gone to find them and found instead 3 separate ledger books and a bundle of papers bound with twine that had been shoved to the back of the drawer in a way that suggested they were meant to be found eventually, or not at all. She took the ledgers to the kitchen table where the light was better. She was not an accountant. Thomas had managed their finances badly, yes, but badly enough that she had been motivated to understand them, in the way failure teaches what comfort doesn't. She knew how accounts were supposed to look. She knew the rhythm of a working property's income and expense, what the cattle cycle looked like, what a dry season did to the numbers, how debt serviced itself when the margins were thin. These ledgers were wrong, not obviously wrong, not the wrong of a man who wasn't trying, the wrong of something that had been adjusted. Small amounts, most of them. Some months, nothing at all, but other months. And she could see the pattern now that she was looking, the way a shape emerged from a picture once you knew to look for it. Money had moved, not out to creditors or not only, somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't accounted for in the expenses column. She sat with this for a long time. Then she heard the back door and she closed the ledger and put her hands around her coffee cup and waited for the sound of Gideon's cane on the floor. He came into the kitchen and stopped. His eyes went to the ledger on the table. She hadn't hidden it, exactly. And then to her face. She said, "Were you aware the household accounts don't add up?" It wasn't a question. He was still in the doorway. Something happened in his expression. Not surprise and not quite guilt either. More like something had been confirmed. "Sit down," he said. She said, "I am sitting. I meant me," he said. And there was something in his voice that might have been almost a dry kind of humor. And she was surprised enough by it that she moved her chair slightly so there was room, and he came and sat across from her and put the cane against the table edge. "I've known the numbers were wrong," he said. "For about 8 months. Since—" He stopped, rubbed the side of his jaw. "Since I started being able to look at things clearly again. After the injury, I wasn't tracking things well. The pain was—" Another stop. He seemed to dislike incomplete sentences, but have trouble with some of them anyway. "I had Silas Boone managing several of my accounts. He offered, after the accident, said it was the neighborly thing." Elena looked at the ledger, then at Gideon. "Silas Boone," she said. "He's the county's largest landowner, or the second largest. He owns the feed supply, the mill, a stake in the bank. Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. "He's been a feature of this county for 15 years. People trust him." "Do you?" The pause before his answer was long enough to be its own answer. "I used to," he said. "I'm not sure what I think now. I don't have proof. I have suspicions, and I have numbers that don't balance, and I have... He looked at the window. I have the feeling of being managed, and I don't know how much of that is real and how much is the past year making me see things dark. Elena looked at the ledger again, at the column of numbers she'd been running in her head, at the small discrepancies that accumulated over 18 months into something that was not small at all. It's real, she said. He looked at her. The discrepancies are consistent with someone who knows what they're doing, she said. They're small. They're timed to seasons when the cash flow is harder to track. Whoever adjusted these knew your accounts well enough to know where gaps would look like ordinary variance. She paused. That's not something a stranger does. Gideon Cross sat with that for a moment. His left hand was on the table and she could see the slight tremor in it. Not dramatic, just the low-level effort of a body managing itself constantly. You can read accounts, he said. Thomas was bad with money, she said. I learned out of necessity. He nodded once, slowly. Then he said, and she wasn't sure she'd heard it right at first. I'm glad you came. It wasn't effusive. It wasn't warm in the way of a man accustomed to expressing things. It was just flat and honest and clearly meant. And that was somehow more than the elaborate kindness of people who had practiced it. She looked at the ledger. We're going to need to pull all of it, she said. Every record going back as far as you have. And we're going to need to be careful about it. Because if someone's been doing this deliberately, they'll notice if we start asking questions in the open. Agreed, he said. And you should tell me about the accident, she said. His face changed. Not dramatically, but something shuddered somewhere behind the eyes. Why? He said. Because I need to understand what we're dealing with, she said, and because I think there's more to it than a thrown horse. The silence in the kitchen was different after that. Not uncomfortable, not quite, but weighted. Gideon Cross looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the window, at the gray light coming through, at the yard where his land stretched out flat and dry and ongoing. The horse wasn't spooked, he said finally. Not by anything natural. I've ridden that animal for 3 years. I know his tells. Something frightened him specifically. And when I went down, he stopped, touched the side of his leg briefly, the way you touched something you'd been trying not to touch. The angle of the injury was wrong. My leg hit wrong. I've had men tell me falls don't happen the way this one did. That the position I was in when Walt found me... He stopped again. Gideon, Elena said. He looked at her. Tell me, she said. He said, Walt thinks someone was in the south pasture that day. He didn't see a face, didn't think anything of it at the time, just someone on the fence line, which happens. But when I think about where I was, and where he was, and the direction the horse moved, Elena sat with this, with the weight of it. Has anyone else suggested that to you? She said. No, he said. Because I haven't told anyone. Because I have nothing solid. And because Silas Boone is a man with friends in every county office and a reputation that people protect. And if I come out saying a man nearly killed me without proof, what happens to me is worse than what happens to him. Elena looked at the ledger. Then we get proof, she said. Outside, beyond the gray window, the Cross Ranch sat in its quiet, rundown state, holding whatever it was holding. Elena thought about the shape of the numbers in the ledger, about the pattern she'd seen in them, about the way small adjustments accumulated, invisibly, into something catastrophic. She thought about a man on a horse in a south pasture, and a figure on a fence line, and an angle of injury that was wrong. She thought about Silas Boone, whom she had not yet met, and whom she already did not trust. She picked up the pen she'd had in her apron pocket and opened the ledger to the first page and began methodically to write down everything she saw. What? It was 3 days later that Silas Boone came to call. He arrived in a carriage, not on horseback, which told you something, Elena thought, about how he preferred to present himself. The carriage was good quality, maintained. He was perhaps 55, heavy in the chest, with a white mustache and the particular confidence of a man who had made people comfortable for so long that it had become reflexive. He smiled easily. He shook hands warmly. He said Elena's name as though he'd known her for years, which she had not given him leave to do. I heard Gideon had finally seen sense and brought some help in, Silas said, settling himself into the chair by the fireplace as though it were his own. He had accepted coffee without being offered it, which Elena noted. It's good. It's very good. A man in Gideon's situation needs reliable support. Gideon sat across from him with his cane between his knees and his face arranged into something neutral. Elena stayed at the kitchen doorway, which gave her the room without quite being in it. Elena's been a real help, Gideon said. His voice was even. I imagine she has. Silas smiled at her. The smile was practiced in the way of a man who knew smiles were useful tools. We were all so sorry to hear about Thomas. Mercer, wasn't it? The farm out on the Briar Road? That's right, Elena said. Terrible thing, losing a farm. Terrible. He shook his head. The land around here is unforgiving if you let things get ahead of you. He paused, the pause timed perfectly. Gideon knows something about that, of course. The past year's been, difficult for all of us who care about this property. He said it in the voice of a man who was accustomed to being trusted with things. Elena looked at him across the room and felt something she could only describe as a cold recognition. The same feeling she'd had when she'd found the pattern in the ledgers. Not dramatic, not a revelation, just the quiet, settling certainty of a thing confirmed. It has been difficult, she said pleasantly, though we're getting a clearer picture of things now that I've had a chance to go through the accounts. Something happened behind Silas Boone's eyes. It was fast, very fast, and he recovered immediately into his genial expression, but it had been there. That's wise, he said. Good financial management is so important. It is, Elena agreed. She poured more coffee than he needed and smiled at him the same way you smiled when you had decided something you hadn't said yet. And she watched him watch her, and neither of them said anything that mattered for the rest of his visit. When he left, the carriage rolling back up the track toward the main road, Gideon sat in his chair by the fireplace and didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, He knows. Not what I know, Elena said. But he knows something's changed. She was looking out the window at the carriage, at the careful, measured way it moved, at the shape of a man who was accustomed to being 3 steps ahead of everyone else and had just encountered something that required recalculation. Good, Gideon said. There was something in the word, not triumph, nothing so clean as that. Just the grim satisfaction of a man who had been sitting in the dark for a year and had finally decided to stand up. Elena turned from the window and went back to the kitchen and opened the ledger to the page she'd marked. She had a great deal more work to do. The ledgers spread across the kitchen table had become, over the following 2 weeks, something close to a second language between them. Elena worked at them in the evenings after supper, when the light from the lamp was good enough and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. Gideon sat across from her sometimes, not always, and on the nights he did, he brought whatever receipts or correspondence he could locate from the years before the accident. Old feed orders, water rights agreements, the occasional letter from a solicitor that had been answered and filed and mostly forgotten. He wasn't talkative about it. He handed things over, she read them. He watched her face for whatever it told him. She tried not to let her face tell him too much too fast. Some of what she was finding, she needed to understand better before she said it out loud. There was a particular kind of harm that came from naming a thing before you were certain of it. She had learned that from Thomas's debts, from the weeks of half-knowledge that had been in some ways worse than the full revelation. She wanted to be certain. What she was certain of by the end of the second week was this. The discrepancies in the Cross Ranch accounts had not begun after Gideon's accident. They had begun approximately 3 years before it, small in the early years, almost invisible. But they were there, and the pattern was consistent, and whoever had built it had been patient. She told Gideon on a Thursday evening when the wind was coming in from the north and the fire needed stoking and Walt and Dix had gone to the bunkhouse. 3 years, Gideon said. At minimum. I don't have the records going back further than that. If you have anything older, I don't. He said it flatly. There was a box of my father's papers. It went missing in the first months after the accident. I assumed it was misfiled somewhere. Elena looked at the lamp. I don't think it was misfiled. He was quiet. Then, how much? She had the number written on a piece of paper. She pushed it across the table. He looked at it. His expression didn't change dramatically. She was learning that Gideon Cross's face was not a dramatic instrument. But something tightened around his eyes, and he set the paper down carefully, the way you set down something you don't want to throw. "That's why the debt won't clear," he said. "The payments you've been making to the bank," she pulled another page, "they're being applied correctly on the bank side, but there's a secondary ledger that Boone has been maintaining, separately, that records a different set of numbers. I think he's been presenting you with his version and keeping the bank at a distance. If you haven't been going to the bank directly—" "I haven't," Gideon said. "He said he'd manage it, said it was easier, given the injury. I was in enough pain that I—" He stopped. The words were clearly uncomfortable for him, not because they were dishonest, but because they required him to acknowledge a period of his own vulnerability that he hadn't fully reconciled with. "I let him." "A lot of people would have," Elena said, and she meant it, and she said it without the particular sweetness that would have made it condescending. He looked at her for a moment. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed, "but it's a reason. There's a difference." He stood, carefully, with the cane, and went to the window. He stood there with his back to her for a while, looking at the dark outside, at the land he couldn't see but knew was there. "My father built this property," he said. "He wasn't a warm man. Wasn't easy. But he built it from nothing, and he kept it, and when he died, I intended to keep it after him." He paused. "The idea that someone has been—" He stopped again. "I know," Elena said. "You don't have to say you know." "All right," she said. He turned back to the room. Whatever he'd been carrying in the window, he seemed to have set down somewhere outside. His face was more contained when he came back to the table, more decided. "What do we do?" he said. "We keep pulling records, and we do it quietly, and we don't let Boone know we're doing it." Gideon nodded once. Then he picked up a piece of paper from the stack and began to read it, and Elena picked up her pen, and they worked in the lamplight until it was late enough that the fire had gone to coals. It was around the same time that Elena began to notice Gideon's leg. She had been noticing it all along, in the way you notice something that was constantly present, the cane against every surface, the particular set of his shoulders when he was managing pain, the way he moved through the house at an angle that distributed weight, in a pattern she recognized as compensatory. But in the third week, she began to notice something more specific. The bad leg moved differently than it had when she arrived. Not well, not freely, but differently. She had a small amount of knowledge about injuries. Not medical knowledge, not formal, but the accumulated understanding of a woman who had nursed a farming household through various misfortunes. She knew about compression and blood flow and the difference between damage that was complete and damage that was interrupted. Thomas had broken his wrist badly 3 years into the marriage, and the doctor who came out from Crestview had talked about nerve involvement and recovery trajectories and the importance of sustained movement. Elena had written it all down in a notebook she still had somewhere, because she wrote things down when she wanted to remember them. She watched Gideon's left leg for a week without comment. On a morning when she was bringing coffee to the porch and he was attempting to negotiate the 2 steps down to the yard, there was a bad moment on the second step, a catch in his movement that made him stop and reset. She said, without planning it entirely, "Can I try something?" He looked at her over his shoulder. "What?" "Your leg. The movement pattern. I want to—" She tried to think of how to say it without it sounding either presumptuous or pitying. "I want to try something with the positioning. It might not help." "And it might," he said, in the dry, flat tone that she'd learned was his version of a joke. "Yes," she said. He stood on the porch step for a moment, then came back up to the top and sat on the rail with the particular controlled motion that substituted for ease. "Go ahead," he said. What she knew about nerve injury and recovery was incomplete and somewhat improvised, which she told him. She did not want him expecting more than she could give. What she had observed was that he favored the outside edge of his foot on the bad leg, which shifted his hip, which torqued his lower back, which made the pain worse in a cycle that probably felt continuous because it nearly was. The original damage was in the lower back. She'd gathered that much from context and from the pattern of how he moved. The leg involvement was consequential, not primary. She had him sit on his porch step and she showed him, with her hands on her own leg first, a different way to hold the foot. Flatter, more deliberate, heel first rather than edge. She felt strange doing it. Practical strange, not embarrassing strange. like the first week in his kitchen where everything had required adjustment. He watched her demonstration and then tried it. He got it wrong the first time. His body defaulted to the familiar pattern before he could override it. He tried again. The third time it held for about 4 steps across the porch before it broke down. He stopped, looked at his foot. "Huh," he said. "It'll take time," she said. "And I might be wrong about the mechanism. You're not wrong," he said. He said it slowly, like a man reassessing a map. "I can feel the difference. The back isn't—" He paused. "It's not the same." She didn't make too much of it. She just told him to try those 4 steps twice a day when he thought of it, and not to push through anything that sharpened into the wrong kind of pain, and to tell her if it got worse. He nodded and picked up his cane and went down the steps. Elena went back inside with the coffee cups and stood at the kitchen counter for a moment before going back to the ledger, feeling something she couldn't entirely name. Not triumph, not pride. Something smaller and warmer. The feeling of having done something that might matter. By the 4th week, she had established a routine for the therapy, though neither of them called it that. It didn't have a name. It was just a thing they did in the mornings on the porch, sometimes with conversation and sometimes without, working through progressions that Elena adjusted based on what she saw. She started adding deliberate weight shifting, getting him to transfer balance from the cane to the leg in controlled increments, then back. He hated the instability of it. He was, she was learning, a man who disliked anything he couldn't control, which the injury had made into a daily humiliation. She understood this too, from her own different experience. She didn't coddle the discomfort. She just noted it and kept going. And after a while, he stopped bracing against it as hard. "You're not what I expected," he said one morning, after a session that had gone better than usual. He was sitting on his porch rail, catching his breath, and she was sitting on the step below with her coffee. "What did you expect?" she said. "I don't know. Someone more—" He searched for the word. "Careful." She almost smiled. "I'm extremely careful. I just don't show it the same way." He looked at her. There was something in his expression that was warmer than his usual register, though he clearly didn't have much practice with warmth, and it sat on him a little unevenly. "The accounts," he said. "What you saw in the first week. Most people would have, I don't know, left it. I told you I wouldn't stay in the dark about things that affect me." "You did." He paused. "I wasn't sure you meant it." "I usually mean what I say," she told him. "It saves time." He was quiet for a moment. The morning was gray-bright, the kind of light that promised nothing but wasn't unpleasant. In the yard, Dix was moving between the paddocks with his characteristic unhurried step. "I haven't talked to anyone about the accident," Gideon said. "What I told you, about Walt, the figure on the fence line." "I know. I want you to know that I've thought about it carefully. I'm not a man who— I don't make accusations I can't support." "I know that too," she said. He looked at his hands on the rail. "If Boone was involved in what happened to me, if that's real and not just my mind making patterns in the dark, then we're not dealing with theft. We're dealing with something I don't have words for that are polite." "Attempted murder," Elena said. She said it plainly, without the particular softness people wrapped around hard words to make them easier. "That's the word for it." He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "Then we need to treat it as that," she said. "And we need to be careful, because if he did it once and didn't succeed, he has reason to try again. And next time he'll know you're not as alone as he thought." Gideon looked at her. Something passed through his eyes that was, she thought, the first genuine, unguarded thing she'd seen from him. Not quite fear, not quite gratitude. Something that didn't have a clean name. "All right," he said. "How do we do this?" "Carefully," she said, "and together." He nodded once, and they both turned and went inside, and the morning moved on. Silas Boone came by the ranch 3 more times in the span of 2 weeks, which was more often than the previous month combined, and Elena understood this to mean that her comment about the accounts had registered more than his composed reaction had let on. He never arrived empty-handed. Once he brought a bottle of brandy, once a small crate of canned goods he said he'd had excess of, once nothing but an offer to have his man come look at the fence line on the north pasture which needed work. He was relentlessly generous in a way that had no relationship to generosity. Elena managed him with a kind of focused pleasantness she had to work at. She served him coffee and said things that meant nothing and watched him watch the house. He had a particular habit of letting his eyes move across the room when he thought she wasn't looking directly at him. Across the desk, the shelves, the kitchen doorway. Looking for evidence of something without knowing what he'd find. She made sure before each visit that the ledger work was not visible anywhere obvious. After his third visit, when his carriage had disappeared up the track, Gideon came to find her in the kitchen. "He looked at your desk," he said. "I know. I moved the important things." "He's getting more interested." "Yes." She was washing cups. She set one down. "He's testing something. He wants to know how much I know, and he's trying to figure it out without asking directly." She paused. "He thinks I'm manageable. He's not sure yet, but that's his working assumption, that I'm a widow who needed a situation and will stay in my lane." Gideon stood in the doorway. "Are you going to let him keep that assumption?" She looked at him. "As long as it's useful, yes. The moment he knows what I've actually found, he'll move. We're not ready for him to move yet." Gideon was quiet for a moment, then, "You're good at this." She didn't say thank you. She said, "I'm good at being underestimated. There's a difference." She picked up the cup again. "People see what they expect to see." Boone expected a desperate woman grateful for any foothold. He built his expectation on what he knew about my circumstances before he knew anything about me. She dried the cup and set it on the shelf. "That's his mistake, and we're going to use it." Gideon looked at her with the particular steady attention he gave to things he was recalculating. "I told Fry you were practical," he said, "when I was setting up the arrangement. He asked what I was hoping for in a wife, and I said practical. He looked at me like I'd said something disappointing." "Most people would," Elena said. "I didn't mean it as a small thing," he said. She looked at him. He was being careful with something. She recognized the particular quality of it, the deliberateness of a man who didn't often try to express things and was aware of his own inexperience with it. "I know you didn't," she said. He nodded, stayed in the doorway for a moment more. Then, "Walt says the North Paddock Post has finally given out completely. I'm going to go look at it." "All right," she said. He left. She stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the shelf where the cup sat and let herself feel briefly the particular strangeness of this life she had landed in. The way it had been one thing in imagination and another entirely in practice, not worse, just more textured, more specific, less abstract. She went back to the ledger. It was in the 5th week that she found the contract. It was buried in a folder of old water rights documents that Gideon had brought from the box under the stairs, the kind of paperwork that accumulated on working properties and never got properly organized, just moved from one container to another and mostly forgotten. She had been working through it methodically, because methodical was the only way she knew, and she almost missed it because it was folded inside another document, and the outer document was unrelated. She unfolded it, read it twice, then read it a third time to make sure she was reading what she thought. It was a transfer agreement, dated 14 months ago, 2 weeks before Gideon's accident. It bore Gideon's signature, or something that looked like his signature, and Silas Boone's, and the signature of a solicitor that was not Mr. Fry. It described a partial transfer of range rights on the eastern portion of the Cross property to a holding entity called Palliser Land and Cattle, which Elena had never heard of. In exchange, Gideon had supposedly received a sum that was not small. She sat with the document for a long time. Long enough that the lamp needed trimming, and she did it without thinking, and then went back to looking at the paper. The money hadn't gone to any account she could trace. The Eastern Range rights, as far as she could tell from the other papers, were still being worked as cross land. And Gideon, she was nearly certain of this, though she hadn't asked him directly, had no memory of signing this. She heard his cane on the stairs. "Gideon," she called. He came to the kitchen doorway, took one look at her face, and came the rest of the way to the table. She pushed the document across to him without speaking. He read it. She watched the stillness that came over him, the particular kind of stillness that meant something was happening underneath that he was managing very carefully. "I didn't sign this," he said. "I know. I mean," he looked up at her. "I know my own signature. This is close, but it's the way I make the G..." He put the document down. I didn't sign this." The date is 2 weeks before the accident, Elena said. He looked at her. The meaning of that passed between them in the silence, complete and quiet and terrible. Palliser Land and Cattle, he said. I've never heard of it. I want to see if Fry has. If Fry's involved, I don't think he is, she said. The signature on this is someone else. I want to show it to Fry because I think he'll recognize who signed it, and because I think he'll know if Palliser is a registered entity and whose name is on it. Gideon sat down heavily. The cane hit the table edge and he caught it without looking, an automatic reflex. He stared at the document. He needed me out of the way, Gideon said slowly. Not just incapacitated. He needed me gone long enough to have this filed, to move the range rights, to set up whatever he was setting up with the eastern pasture. He paused. And I nearly was. Gone. For a month after the fall, I was barely... He stopped. Elena waited. I was in enough pain that I signed what was put in front of me, he said quietly. I don't remember half of it. Fry came once with papers. I signed them. I don't know what they were. He looked at his hands. If Boone came with papers in those early weeks, I might have... You didn't sign this one, Elena said firmly. The signature is wrong. Someone else signed your name. Which is worse, Gideon said, which is considerably worse. Yes, she said, it is. They sat with the document between them on the table. Outside the wind had picked up, and the house made its small sounds of resistance against it. The creak of the porch boards, the rattle of the loose shutter on the east window that neither of them had gotten to yet. We need a lawyer, Gideon said. Someone who isn't Fry, in case... Fry's clean, Elena said. I'd stake something on it. But yes, we need someone from outside Callaway Flats, someone Boone doesn't have connections with. Crestview has a lawyer I've heard of, Harlan Voss. He did work for a rancher I knew, a man named Pettit. Pettit said he was honest. Write to him, Elena said. This week. Don't go through anyone local. Don't use the post office here if you can avoid it. Gideon nodded. His jaw was tight. You know what this means. If Boone finds out we're building a case, he'll act before we're ready, Elena finished. I know, which is why we need to be ready before he finds out. She looked at the document. How long do we need? He thought about it. The eastern pasture, if he's planning to move on those range rights, he'd want to do it before winter, before the cattle cycles change. That gives us, he thought, 6 weeks? If we're pushing. 6 weeks, Elena said. She put the document back in the folder and put the folder inside the ledger and put the ledger at the back of the kitchen shelf behind the flour canister, which was one of the places she'd learned Silas Boone's eyes didn't go. Then she picked up her pen and started a list. Tunt. The therapy continued through all of this, which Elena thought was probably important in ways that were not only practical. There was something in the structure of it, the daily work, the small and measurable progress, the fact that it was a thing they did together that had nothing to do with accounts or lawyers or forged signatures, that held something in place between them. She couldn't have said exactly what. It was not a romantic thing. It was not simple. It was the particular bond that came from working alongside someone in sustained difficulty, the way you got to know the quality of a person through how they behaved when things were hard. What she knew about Gideon Cross, 6 weeks in, was this. He was not a patient man by nature, but he had learned patience out of necessity, and the learned kind had more depth to it. He was proud in the specific way that made him push too hard sometimes, and then have to stop and recalibrate, which he did without self-pity, which she respected. He was funnier than he appeared, and the humor came out in small, dry flashes that she had stopped being surprised by and started waiting for. He worked, when the leg allowed, in the way of a man for whom work was not separate from self. The ranch was not just property to him. She had understood this intellectually from early on. She understood it differently now. He was also, she noticed, watching her differently than he had at the beginning. Not in a way she could have pointed to and said, here, this moment. More gradual than that. The way he listened when she talked, with a quality of attention that was not performance. The way he had started telling her things in the evenings that he didn't need to tell her, operational details about the ranch's history, observations about the land, occasional fragments of his father that came out unexpectedly, and which he clearly hadn't planned to say. He was not, she thought, a man who had spoken much to anyone for a long time. Not because he was incapable, but because there had been no one worth speaking to. She didn't analyze it too closely. It felt delicate in the way of things that broke if you pressed them too hard. One evening, near the end of the 6th week, she was working at the table and he came in from the yard, and she heard the difference in his step before she looked up. The cane was there, but the weight on it was less. She looked up. He crossed the kitchen to the counter without the particular bracing she was used to seeing. The left leg was still wrong, still compensating, still not fully reliable, but there was a quality of intention in it that hadn't been there before. He moved like a man who was inside his own body making decisions, not just managing damage. He noticed her looking. "Better day," he said. "I can see that," she said. He stood at the counter and poured water from the pitcher and drank it, and then he stood there for a moment looking out the window the way he did when he was working something out. "When I came back from buying that first horse," he said, "the one I was riding the day of the accident, I was 26. It was the first truly good animal I'd purchased with my own money. I rode him home, and I let him go at a full run across the east pasture just because I could." He paused. "I want to be able to do that again. Not the same horse, just that again." He said it matter-of-factly, without theater. But Elena heard the weight in it, all the things it stood for, all the territory between now and that. "Then we keep working," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face was for a moment less armored than usual. Not vulnerable in the way of a man who had given up his defenses, but in the way of a man who had decided, carefully and deliberately, to let something through. "Yes," he said, "we do." Outside, the late afternoon was turning the dry land a color that was almost gold, which was the best it ever managed. The ranch sat in it, run down and ongoing, holding whatever it was holding. Elena turned back to her ledger. Gideon stood at the window for a while longer before going upstairs. In the flower canister's shadow on the shelf, the forged contract sat in its folder, waiting. And somewhere in the county, in his well-maintained office, with his well-maintained confidence, Silas Boone was beginning, Elena was certain, to understand that the widow on the Cross Ranch was not what he had taken her for. She intended to let him figure out exactly how much he had miscalculated. She intended to make sure, when that moment came, that she was ready for what it set in motion. She picked up her pen and kept writing, and the lamp burned steady, and outside the night came in slow and dark, and full of the kind of quiet that preceded things. The letter from Harlan Voss arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a larger envelope addressed to Walt, which had been Elena's idea. She had written to Voss through a roundabout channel, a woman she'd known briefly in Crestview before her marriage, a seamstress named Addie who owed her nothing but had agreed to receive and forward correspondence as a favor. Elena had explained nothing beyond the basics. She needed a lawyer who worked independently, who had no existing ties to Callaway Flats or its county offices, and who could be trusted with documents of a sensitive nature. Addie had forwarded the response without comment, which Elena appreciated. Voss's letter was 3 pages, written in a cramped, efficient hand that suggested a man who didn't waste paper or words. He had heard of Palliser land and cattle. It was registered in the county seat as a private holding company, incorporated approximately 16 months ago, with a single named officer, not Silas Boone, but a man named Reginald Cutter, who was, Voss wrote, Boone's brother-in-law, and had worked as his land agent for 11 years. The Eastern Range rights transfer, if it had been recorded with the county, would be searchable. Voss had not yet searched, pending confirmation that Gideon wished to engage his services. He listed his fee. He said he could come to Callaway Flats or meet elsewhere, at their preference, and noted that elsewhere was probably wiser. Elena read the letter at the kitchen table in the early morning before anyone else was up, and then folded it back into the envelope and held it for a moment, feeling the particular quality of a thing that was moving toward a point of no return. She heard Gideon's uneven step on the stairs. He came into the kitchen and she slid the letter across the table without preamble. He read it standing up, one hand on the table for balance, the cane hooked over his forearm in the way he'd developed over the past weeks when he needed both hands. She watched his face. When he finished, he set the letter down and stood there for a moment with his eyes on the window. "Cutter," he said. "Boone's brother-in-law." "Yes." So it goes back to Boone directly. Through one layer of family, yes. He straightened up carefully. Engage him. Tell him Crestview. I don't want him here until we're ready. He paused. How much more do we need? Elena thought about the stack of documents she'd accumulated over 7 weeks. The adjusted ledgers, the forged transfer agreement, the record of payments that didn't correspond to any legitimate expense, the timeline she'd built of Boone's involvement in Gideon's accounts going back 3 years. What she had was substantial. What she didn't have yet was a witness. Paper could be argued with. Paper could be called a misunderstanding or a clerical error, or the confused records of an injured man's disorganized affairs. A person who had seen something or been asked to do something they understood was wrong was harder to dismiss. A witness, she said. One person who can corroborate what the documents show, preferably someone who interacted with Boone directly in a way that puts him in the middle of the accounts rather than at the edge. Gideon was quiet for a moment. The bank teller, he said. Young man named Posner. He's been at the Callaway Bank 2 years. When Boone brought me in, the one time after the accident when I was still in bad shape, Posner was the one who processed the papers. I remember he looked uncomfortable. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Do you know him? Not well. He's Hester Posner's youngest. She's a decent woman. I'll find a way to speak with him, Elena said. Carefully, Gideon looked at her. The morning light was coming through the window and it caught the side of his face, and she saw, not for the first time, how much older the past year had made him. Not in age exactly, but in the particular erosion that sustained pain and isolation produced. He was better than he had been. She could see that too. The improvement was slow and nonlinear, and some days worse than others, but the arc of it, over 7 weeks, was real. Elena, he said. She looked up. Be careful with Posner, he said. Not because I don't trust your judgment, because if Boone has anyone watching who he's worried about, Posner is a likely candidate. The boy's been in a position to see things. I know, she said. I'll be careful. He nodded. Poured his own coffee for the first time since she'd arrived. She noticed this, the small shift of it, the way he'd stopped waiting for things to be handed to him as a matter of course, and took it to the window. She wrote to Addie that morning, for Voss. And then she started thinking about Hester Posner's youngest, and what a natural occasion for conversation might look like. She found it 11 days later at Harmon's General Store. She had made a point of going to town more regularly than she had in the first weeks. Not conspicuously, not on a schedule that would look like anything, just frequently enough that her presence in Callaway Flats had become ordinary. She bought supplies. She exchanged the standard pleasantries. She was polite to women who had been cool to her in the months after Thomas's death, because being polite to people who'd been cold to her cost her nothing and gave them no useful information about what she was thinking. The town's opinion of her had shifted slightly. She was aware of it the way you became aware of weather, gradually, through accumulation of small signals. She was no longer the desperate widow who'd taken any arrangement available. She was the woman who'd gone to the Cross Ranch and apparently stabilized it, which gave her a different kind of standing. Not warm standing, more functional. People knew where she fit now, which made them less uneasy. Posner was in Harmon's buying a spool of wire when she came in, which was not planned but which she was willing to use. He was perhaps 22, slight, with reddish hair, and the kind of face that showed what it was feeling without his permission. She had observed him from a distance twice in the preceding weeks and noted that he moved through town quickly, kept his eyes forward, and did not linger. A man working at staying out of things. She positioned herself near enough to exchange a hello and took her time at the dry goods shelf, and when the moment was natural, she said, quietly, and without any particular emphasis, "You were there the day Gideon signed the refinancing papers, after his accident." Posner went very still. He didn't look at her directly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and tight. "I'm not accusing you of anything," she said. She kept her voice level, conversational, the kind of tone that didn't carry to the next aisle. "I just want to know if you remember that day." A pause. His hands had stopped moving on the spool of wire. "I remember it," he said. "Did the papers look right to you?" Another pause. Longer. She waited. She had learned that the kind of silence that made most people rush to fill it was often the most productive silence you could offer. Mr. Boone handled everything, Posner said. I just processed what was brought to me. I know, Elena said. Did they look right? He exhaled through his nose, a short, controlled exhale that told her everything she needed to know about how long he had been holding this particular question. Some of the figures were... He stopped. I'm not in a position to talk about bank business. I understand that, she said. I'm asking what you observed, not what the bank did. He finally looked at her sideways, briefly, the look of a man calculating the distance between where he stood and where he wanted to be. The figures Boone presented didn't match what was in the register, he said. I flagged it to my supervisor. He told me the discrepancy was a previous adjustment and to process the papers as presented. He paused. My supervisor is Callum Ward. He's been at the bank 18 years. He and Boone... He stopped again. Thank you, Elena said. She moved to put her selection on the counter, casual and unhurried. I'm sorry for the position you're in. I want you to know that there are people working on this who understand what you've been carrying. She didn't ask him for anything further. She didn't need to. She'd gotten what she came for, and she understood that asking for more in that moment would be pushing on something that could close entirely. She paid for her goods and drove the wagon back to the ranch and went directly to the ledger and added Posner's name and what he had said to her careful, accumulating record. Silas Boone came to the ranch on a Friday afternoon 3 days after the Harmons encounter, and something about this visit was different before he had opened his mouth. He arrived without the carriage this time, on horseback, which was faster and left less warning. He was at the porch before Elena heard the hooves, and she came out to meet him drying her hands on a cloth. And his expression when he saw her was still polished and friendly, but there was something underneath it that had not been there before, a quality of assessment that had dropped its pretense of casualness. Elena, he said, swinging down from the horse with the ease of a man in good health. I was hoping Gideon was about. He's in the south pasture, she said. I can send Dix. No. He waved the offer off and stepped up to the porch with the familiarity of a man who believes spaces were his by default. It's a fine afternoon. I'll wait. He looked at her. Though I'm glad to have a moment with you, actually. She stepped back to let him in, because refusing him entry had no tactical value yet. She brought coffee she didn't want to bring and sat across from him and waited. I hear you've been asking around town, he said. His voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. About the ranch accounts, talking to people. He paused. People talk. You know how it is. I've been doing the household management, Elena said. That involves conversations with suppliers and... Of course it does, he said. He smiled. Of course. I just wanted to mention it, as a friend of the property. People in Callaway Flats form impressions quickly. A woman in your position, new to the ranch, coming from a difficult circumstance, you'd want to be careful not to give the wrong impression. He held his coffee cup with both hands in a way that looked comfortable and was not. People might think you were stirring up trouble when you were only trying to help, and that wouldn't be fair to you. Elena looked at him. That's very considerate, she said. I've always been fond of Gideon, Boone said. We go back a long way, since before his father died. I want to see the ranch succeed. I want to see him. A brief pause, barely perceptible, well supported. He said the last two words with a quality she felt in the back of her spine. Not a threat in any form that could be named and reported. A warning, dressed in concern, wrapped in friendliness. She understood then that he had decided something. She didn't know what precisely had triggered it. Posner, possibly. Or something else. Some other thread she hadn't been careful enough with. But he had decided that she was no longer a quantity he could wait and observe. He was moving to the next thing. I appreciate that, she said. She kept her voice even. It means a lot to know you're looking out for the property. He left 20 minutes later when Gideon came in from the south pasture, and the two men had a conversation on the porch that Elena listened to from the kitchen with the window cracked. It was mundane, fence work, cattle pricing, the state of the road to the county seat. Boone was warm and easy with Gideon in a way that turned her stomach. The fluency of a man who had been performing friendship for so long, he no longer registered it as performance. When he rode away, Gideon came inside and closed the door. He knew, Elena said. Something, Gideon agreed. His face was tight. He asked me how you were settling in. The way he asked it, "He's going to do something," she said. "I don't know what yet, but he's made a decision." Gideon stood in the middle of the room. She watched him process it, the controlled way he did it, the internal adjustment she'd learned to recognize. "Then so do we," he said. What Silas Boone did was elegant in its ugliness, which she should have anticipated but hadn't anticipated quite this specifically. It started with a story. She didn't know who first said it or where it began. These things rarely had clean origins. They emerged from the particular ecology of small towns where information moved in currents and certain people controlled the currents. What she knew was that by the following Wednesday, 2 different women had looked at her in Callaway Flats with an expression she recognized, the careful blankness of people who had heard something they were deciding whether to believe. Mrs. Platt told her on Thursday. She came to the ranch herself, which she had not done before, which meant the situation had moved past the stage of comfortable indirection. "I think you should hear it from someone who tells you plainly," Mrs. Platt said. She was sitting at the kitchen table, and for once she was looking directly at Elena, rather than at any available surface. "There's a story going around that you and the veterinarian, Aldous Crane, that there's something improper, that he comes out to the ranch regularly, and that it isn't for the animals." Elena sat with this for a moment. Crane did come to the ranch. He had come twice for legitimate purposes, because they had 2 horses with a hoof issue and Walt had fetched him. She had spoken to him on both occasions in the yard, briefly, about the horses. She had not been alone with him, and the conversations had lasted under 10 minutes combined. "That's not true," she said. "I know it's not," Mrs. Platt said with a certainty that surprised Elena slightly. "I've known Aldous Crane 20 years, and I know your situation, and I'm not an idiot." She paused. "But I'm telling you because people are hearing it, and in a town this size, a story like that—" She stopped. "You know what it does to a woman standing?" Elena looked at the table. "And to a marriage," she said. "Yes," Mrs. Platt said quietly, "and to a marriage." After Mrs. Platt left, Elena sat in the kitchen for a long time. She was not, she discovered, afraid. She was angry, a cold, level, sustainable anger, the kind that didn't produce rashness but produced clarity. She thought about Silas Boone and his pleasant face and his carriage and his practiced warmth, and the specific calculation involved in choosing this particular weapon. He had looked at her situation, a new wife, uncertain standing, a marriage the town already viewed with the mild skepticism of a purely practical arrangement. And he had found the exact point of maximum leverage. The question was what to do about it. She was still sitting there when Gideon came in. He read her face immediately. She had noticed he was good at this, better than she'd given him credit for in the early weeks, the attentiveness of a man who had learned to read rooms from a position of disadvantage. "What happened?" he said. She told him. All of it. She watched his face through it, and she saw the particular sequence of expressions. First the tightening, then something that might have been anger, then something that settled into a stillness she had learned to read as him deciding what kind of man he was going to be about something. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to know if I believe it?" he said. "I already know you don't," she said. "You're not a man who—" "Elena." His voice was quiet, but it stopped her. "I want to say it directly. Not because you need me to, because you clearly don't, but because you should hear it said." He looked at her. "I don't believe it. I know what I've seen in this house for 8 weeks, and I know the character of the person I've seen, and I don't believe it." She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "It's not a favor," he said. "It's just the truth." She nodded. They sat with that for a moment, and it was one of those moments she'd learned to let be what it was. Not larger, not smaller. "He's frightened," she said then. "Good," Gideon said. "It means we're close enough that he needed to act. He's trying to destroy my credibility before I can use what I have." She paused. "If people believe the story, if the town thinks I'm a woman of questionable character, then anything I present about the accounts becomes a desperate woman's accusation. He's not just trying to hurt me, he's trying to make me inadmissible." Gideon's jaw was tight. "What do you need?" "Time," she said. 2 more weeks, maybe 3. I need Voss here. I need the county records that corroborate the forged transfer. And I need—" She stopped. What? I need Walt, she said. I need Walt to tell what he saw in the south pasture the day of your accident, in writing, witnessed and signed. A silence. That's asking him to go up against Boone, Gideon said. I know. Walt has a sister in the county. Her husband works at Boone's mill. I know that too, she said. I'm not going to ask you to ask him. That has to be your decision and his decision. Gideon was quiet for a long time, long enough that she heard Dix moving in the yard and a horse somewhere in the east paddock, and the small sounds of the afternoon settling into itself. I'll talk to him tonight, Gideon said. The conversation with Walt she wasn't present for. She had made supper, and Walt had eaten it with his usual unhurried appetite, and she had taken her coffee to the front room and left the two men in the kitchen, which was as clear a signal as she could give. She sat in the front room and listened to the murmur of their voices without words, and looked at her hands. She thought about what she was asking, not of Walt specifically, but of all the pieces of this thing she was assembling. She thought about the forged signature on the transfer document, about Posner's face in Harmon's general store, the exhale through his nose, the weight of what he'd been holding. About Mrs. Platt's kitchen 2 months ago and $47 and a signed marriage contract on a gray morning. She thought about the story now moving through Callaway Flats and the way a woman's reputation functioned in a place like this, how it could be built over years and dismantled in a week, how it required exactly nothing to damage and enormous work to repair. She had never been a woman whose reputation was her primary concern, but she understood that it was being used as a weapon now, which was different from not caring about it. You could not afford to be indifferent to a weapon pointed at you. Gideon came to the front room doorway after perhaps an hour. He'll do it, he said. He wanted you to know it was his own decision. I told him I didn't ask him, and he said that's why he's doing it. Elena looked up. He's a good man, she said. He's been with this property 15 years, Gideon said. He came into the room and sat in the chair by the window, the cane across his knees. He knew my father. He stopped. He said he's known something was wrong since Boone started coming around after the accident. Said it felt wrong in a way he couldn't name. He's been waiting for someone to name it. Elena nodded. Outside, the night was full dark and the wind had stopped and the land was very still, the way it got sometimes in this part of the territory when the weather was deciding something. She thought about Silas Boone in his house somewhere, confident in his move, waiting to see the effect of the story. I'm going to write to Voss tomorrow, she said. I'm going to tell him we need to move up the meeting. Do you think we have enough? She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about all things, not how she wanted it to look, but how it actually stood. Close, she said. Not quite. I need the county records to come back from Voss, and I need Walt's statement properly witnessed. She paused. But I think we're going to run out of time before we're perfectly ready. Boone's going to escalate, and I'd rather move from a position that's strong enough than wait for perfect. Gideon turned this over. What does escalate look like? He said. He'll go to the sheriff, she said, or to someone on the county board. He'll try to make this official before we can. He'll frame me, as a woman causing trouble. Possibly that I've been manipulating you, that the marriage itself is... She stopped, chose her words. That your judgment has been compromised. Gideon's face did something she didn't have a name for. He'll say that, he said. Not a question. If he thinks it'll work, yes. A long silence. Then let him, Gideon said. His voice had changed. Not heated. Gideon Cross was not a heated man, but something had settled in it, something with weight and permanence. Let him call the sheriff and the county board and whoever else he wants to call. Let him put us all in a room, because I will be in that room, and I will say what I know, and what I know is true. Elena looked at him. You might not be walking without the cane yet, she said. Not gently, just accurately. I know, he said, but I'll be there. She held his gaze for a moment. The lamp between them made the room small and warm against the dark outside. She thought about the man she had met in a cold solicitor's office 2 months ago, careful, tired, armored, watching her from behind a wall of managed pain. She thought about who was sitting across from her now, and the distance between those two people, and what had crossed that distance. All right, she said. She went back to work. She wrote to Voss. She pulled Walt's statement form and drafted the language carefully, factually, without embellishment. She organized the documents in the order she expected to need them. She worked until the lamp was low, and then she trimmed it and worked a little longer. In the yard, the horses moved in their paddock, and somewhere out past the east pasture, beyond the fence line where Walt had seen a figure standing on the day of the accident, the land ran flat and dark and ongoing, indifferent to all of it. She was not indifferent. She had stopped being indifferent some time ago, somewhere between the ledger and the porch steps, and the dry, flat sound of Gideon's voice saying, "I don't believe it. Not as a favor, just as the truth." She sealed Voss's letter and set it by the door for morning. She had not planned to fight for this ranch. She had not planned to fight for this marriage or this man or this particular piece of dry, ongoing land. But something had happened over 8 weeks that she understood as plainly as she understood the pattern in the ledgers. She was no longer fighting because she had no other choice. She was fighting because she had decided to, which was an entirely different thing, and it was the difference that mattered. She blew out the lamp and went upstairs, and the house settled around her, and outside the dark land waited for morning. Harlan Voss arrived in Callaway Flats on a Thursday morning in a rented buggy with a leather satchel across his knees and the particular unhurried manner of a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where other people were losing their composure. He was older than Elena had imagined from his letters, mid-60s, with white hair cut close and a face that had the quality of old timber, worn and dense and not going anywhere. He shook her hand when she met him at the road, not in the performative way of men who shook women's hands to demonstrate they were progressive about it, but in the straightforward way of someone greeting a colleague. "Mrs. Cross," he said. "Mr. Voss," she said. "Come inside." They worked for 6 hours at the kitchen table. Voss went through everything she had assembled: the ledgers, the forged transfer, the timeline, the payment records, the letter from Posner that she had asked him to write, and that he had, after 4 days of silence, slid under the door of Harmon's General Store in a sealed envelope addressed to no one. Walt's statement was there too, witnessed by Dix and by the minister from the church in Crestview who had been passing through and whose impartiality no one could question. Voss read everything twice, in the same order both times, without comment. Gideon sat at the far end of the table and said very little. He had been quiet all morning in a way that was different from his usual quiet, less contained, more like something held at careful tension. Elena had noticed it at breakfast and said nothing about it. When Voss finished, he set the last document down and looked at the middle distance for a moment. "The forged signature alone is actionable," he said. "Combined with the payment discrepancies and the Palliser Incorporation records," he tapped the county filing he'd obtained, which showed Cutter's name on the entity and the date of its registration, 3 weeks before Gideon's accident. "This is not a thin case. This is a case." He looked at Gideon. "Your account of the accident and Walt's corroborating statement about the figure on the fence line, that's the part that will be harder. Attempted harm is a serious charge and the evidence is circumstantial." "I know," Gideon said. "Circumstantial doesn't mean weak," Voss said. "It means it relies on the jury, or in this case the county board, connecting what they're shown. The timing of the Palliser Incorporation, the forged transfer, the fact that you were incapacitated and for a period largely incapable of managing your own affairs, which benefited Boone considerably." He looked at the papers. "The story it tells is coherent. It requires someone to be willing to hear it." "The sheriff," Elena said. "Reardon. Do you know him?" Voss considered. "By reputation. He's not corrupt, as far as I've heard. He's also not a man who makes enemies of powerful people without strong cause." "Then we give him strong cause," Elena said. "We don't ask him to take our word for anything. We put it all in front of him, and we let the documents do the talking." Voss looked at her. Something in his expression was the professional equivalent of approval, which was not effusive but which she registered. "There's a problem with that approach," he said. "Timing. I received word this morning, through a contact in the county offices, that Boone has requested a meeting with the sheriff and 2 members of the county board. For Friday." The room was quiet for a moment. "Tomorrow," Gideon said. "Late afternoon," Voss said. "My contact doesn't know the stated purpose, but the guest list suggests it involves a property matter. And given the timing, he's moving first," Elena said. She had known this was coming. She had told Gideon it was coming. But knowing and having it arrive were different things, and for a moment she felt the particular sensation of a floor shifting slightly. Not collapsing, just moving, the way ground did sometimes when you thought it was solid. She looked at the documents on the table. Then she looked at Voss. "Can we be in that room?" she said. Voss was quiet for a moment. "The meeting is at the county office. It's technically a public building. A formal board meeting requires public notice. An informal meeting." He paused. "An informal meeting can be attended if you have standing to raise a matter before the board." He looked at the papers. "A property dispute, backed by documented evidence of fraud, gives you standing." "Then we go tomorrow," Elena said. Gideon said, "Elena." "We go tomorrow," she said again. "Not hard. Not heated. Certain." He chose the timing. He thinks we're not ready. The advantage we have is that he doesn't know what we have, and the only way to use that advantage is to show up before he's had time to build the room against us. Gideon looked at her. A long look, the kind he gave things he was measuring seriously. "All right," he said. Voss began organizing the documents into the order they would need for presentation. Elena went to the stove to make coffee because her hands needed something to do, and because the next 12 hours were going to require thinking she didn't want to do in a state of agitation. She heard Gideon behind her push back from the table and stand, and she heard the cane, and then she heard him move toward the back door. "I'm going to the south pasture," he said. "I'll be an hour." She didn't ask why. She understood it, the need to stand on his own land for a while and look at it before tomorrow. She understood it the way she understood most things about him now, not because he had explained, but because you could not share a house with a person for 9 weeks, through the kind of sustained difficulty they had shared and remain opaque to each other. "Take your time," she said. She heard the door. She heard his footsteps on the porch, and then on the steps, and then the sound of him in the yard. And then she heard something that made her go still at the stove. She heard the cane stop. She heard footsteps, both feet, deliberate, measured, continuing without it. She stood at the stove and didn't turn around. She looked at the wall in front of her and listened to the sound of Gideon Cross walking across his yard, unsteady and slow and imperfect and upright. And she felt something move through her chest that she was not going to examine too closely, because there wasn't time and because some things were better left to settle on their own. Behind her, Voss was quietly organizing papers. She poured the coffee and brought it to the table and sat down and said, "Tell me exactly how we present this." She did not sleep well. This was not surprising. She lay in the east room with the morning light still hours away and thought through the order of the documents the way she had thought through the ledger numbers in the early weeks. Methodically, testing each link in the chain, looking for the place where the logic failed or the gap where Boone could insert a denial. She found several places where the evidence required inference rather than direct proof, and she sat with each one and thought about how to present it so that the inference was unavoidable rather than merely suggested. Around 2 in the morning, she heard movement in the hall. Gideon knocked twice on her door, which was their established signal for something that required attention without alarm. She opened it. He was standing in the hall in his shirt and trousers, no cane, his left hand against the wall for the steadiness the hall's narrowness provided. He looked like a man who had also not been sleeping. "I thought of something," he said. "The water rights meeting, 3 years ago, when Boone first started managing the accounts. I had a meeting with him and Ward from the bank about the water access on the North Creek. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but..." He paused. "I never signed off on any changes to the water rights. As far as I was aware, nothing changed. But 2 months after that meeting, the North Creek easement was moved. On the county record. I only know because my neighbor Tully mentioned it in passing when he was dealing with his own water access issue. He said the county record showed the cross easement had shifted." Elena was very still. "Did you investigate it at the time?" "No, Tully said his information might be wrong. I was in the early part of the accounts management with Boone, and I trusted him, and I let it go." He looked at her. "That's another forged document somewhere. Or a filed amendment that you never authorized," she said. "Which is the same thing." "Yes," she said. "Can Tully testify to what he saw in the county record?" He's in Crestview now. He moved his family last spring after his water dispute resolved badly. A pause. But Voss could pull the county record directly. If the filing date matches the period when Boone was managing the accounts, I'll tell Voss first thing, she said. He may be able to get it before the afternoon. Gideon nodded. He stood in the hallway for a moment, his hand against the wall, and she stood in the doorway, and neither of them said the things that were available to say about the situation, about tomorrow, about the particular way the past 9 weeks had built into this specific night in this specific hallway. Try to sleep, she said. You too, he said. Neither of them did particularly, but morning came anyway. Voss sent a wire to his contact at the county office at 7 in the morning and had a response by 9, confirming that a water rights amendment on the Cross North Creek easement had been filed 38 months ago, with a signature that was Gideon's and a notarization that was performed by a notary whose license, Voss noted with the particular satisfaction of a man who appreciated when evidence assembled itself helpfully, had expired 6 months before the filing date. Elena read the wire at the kitchen table and handed it to Gideon without a word. He read it, set it down. Invalid notarization, he said. Which makes the filing void, Voss said from across the table, and which adds a third forged document to our record. The transfer agreement, the bank papers from the period of your incapacitation, and now this. He looked at Gideon. He's been doing this for years, and he's been doing it with the same small circle of people, Cutter, Ward at the bank, and whoever he used for the notarization. He paused. Which means there are people in Callaway Flats who know pieces of this, who've participated in pieces of it, and who, when presented with the full picture, will need to make a decision about which side of it they stand on. Ward, Elena said, at the bank. Ward is going to be in that room this afternoon, Voss said. He's one of the county board members Boone requested. A silence. He knows what's in our documents, Gideon said. He knows what he did, Elena said. That's not the same as knowing what we have. And when he sees it laid out, she paused. A man like Ward has been going along with this because Boone's power made it the path of least resistance. The moment Boone's power is in question, the calculation changes. You're counting on him to break, Gideon said. I'm counting on him to be a man who looks at the evidence and understands what happens to him if he doesn't, she said. Which is different. Voss looked at her with the same expression he'd had the day before, the professional equivalent of approval. We should go, he said. I'd like to be in that building before Boone arrives. Schwas. The Callaway Flats County office was a 2-story brick building on the main street, solid and unadorned, with the look of something built to convey authority rather than comfort. Elena had been inside it twice, once to file a document related to Thomas's estate, once to handle a property matter in the final days before the farm was vacated. Both times it had felt like a room designed to make her feel procedural rather than present. She felt differently walking into it today. She was in her good dress, which was dark blue wool and fit her imperfectly in the way her clothes often did, tighter across the shoulders than the pattern intended, the waist sitting slightly wrong. And she had done her hair with more care than usual, and she had brought her documents in a leather case that Voss had provided, and she had brought, underneath all of it, 9 weeks of work, and the specific cold anger of a woman who has been patient long enough. Voss walked to the clerk's desk and stated their business with the brisk authority of a man who knew exactly what standing he had and intended to use it. The clerk was young and looked uncertain. He disappeared through a door and came back with a supervisor, and Voss explained again, and the supervisor disappeared, and when he returned, he said the board would see them. The meeting room was on the 2nd floor. It was plain, a long table, chairs, 2 windows that looked onto the street. When Elena, Gideon, and Voss were shown in, 3 men were already there. Sheriff Reardon, who was perhaps 50 with a gray mustache and the careful eyes of a man who made a practice of reading situations before reacting. Callum Ward from the bank, who was exactly as Elena had imagined from Posner's description, heavy and institutional, with the face of a man who had learned to look unconcerned through sustained effort, and a county board member named Garrett, whom Elena didn't know but who looked at their entrance with the expression of someone who had expected a different meeting than the one that appeared to be developing. Silas Boone was not there yet. Reardon looked at Voss first. I wasn't told this was a formal proceeding. It isn't, Voss said pleasantly. But we understand there's a meeting this afternoon regarding property matters that concern my clients, and as the affected parties, they have a right to be present. Reardon looked at Gideon. Something moved through the sheriff's expression. Recognition, maybe. And beneath that, something harder to name. He had known Gideon's father. Elena had learned this from Walt. It didn't necessarily mean anything, but it wasn't nothing either. "Sit down," Reardon said. They sat. Voss placed his satchel on the table and opened it with the unhurried movements of a man who had done this many times. Ward was looking at the satchel. Elena watched Ward looking at it. The door opened and Silas Boone walked in. He stopped when he saw them. It was a very brief stop, half a second, maybe less, and he recovered immediately into his easy confidence. But Elena had been watching for it, and she saw it, and it told her everything she needed to know about the next hour. He had not known they would be here. He had believed he had more time. "Gideon," he said warmly, as though this were a social call. "And Elena." He looked at Voss. "I don't believe we've met." "Harlan Voss," Voss said. "Attorney, Crestview." Something moved in Boone's eyes. He sat down across from them and smiled the smile that by now Elena understood as his primary instrument of control. "Well," he said, "quite the gathering." Reardon said, "Mr. Boone, you requested this meeting. Would you like to state your purpose?" "Of course." Boone settled in his chair with the ease of a man in his own living room. "I've been concerned as a longtime friend of the Cross Ranch and of Gideon himself about certain disturbances that have been developing since Gideon's recent marriage. There have been irregularities in how the ranch accounts have been managed. Questions raised about financial documents that have been circulating inappropriately. And there is the matter of certain accusations being made." He paused with the precise theatrical regret of a man who practiced it. "Accusations coming from a woman whose own financial history, whose circumstances leading to this marriage, suggest a motivation for making claims that could benefit her position." He said it looking at Reardon, not at Elena. This was deliberate. She was to be spoken about rather than spoken to. She was to be a subject rather than a presence. "Mrs. Cross," Reardon said, and he was looking at her. "Yes," she said. "Mr. Boone seems to be suggesting you have a financial motivation to make false claims against him." "He is," she said. "He's also suggesting it preemptively, which is worth noting." She opened the leather case. "I'd like to present what we've gathered, if the board will hear it." Reardon looked at Garrett. Garrett nodded. Reardon said, "Go ahead." She started with the ledgers. Not the most dramatic document. She had thought hard about the order, and Voss had agreed. Because you didn't lead with the most dramatic thing. You built. You laid the foundation first, the thing nobody could argue with, the numbers that were simply wrong and demonstrably wrong, and you let the room sit with that before you gave them the next layer. She walked through the discrepancies methodically, without heat, the way she had walked through them at the kitchen table 9 weeks ago. She cited page numbers, she cited dates, she cited amounts. She did not editorialize. She did not look at Boone while she did it. She looked at Reardon and occasionally at Garrett, and she spoke in the clear, unhurried voice of a woman who had nothing to hide and was not in any hurry. Boone interrupted twice in the first 10 minutes. Once to suggest the discrepancies were the result of poor record-keeping, which she addressed by showing the pattern's consistency across 18 months. Once to suggest she was misreading the accounts, which she addressed by placing the original ledger and her transcription side by side on the table and inviting anyone present to check her arithmetic. Nobody checked. But Ward was looking at the table with the expression of a man who already knew the arithmetic was right. Then she presented the Palliser Incorporation documents. The room was quieter after that. She let it be quiet for a moment before she continued. Then she placed the forged transfer agreement on the table, the one with Gideon's signature that was not his signature, and she said, "Mr. Cross would like to state for the record that he did not sign this document." "That's a serious claim," Boone said. His voice was still controlled, but something had changed in the quality of it. "It is," Elena agreed. "Mr. Cross, would you like to speak to the signature?" Gideon leaned forward. He had been sitting beside her with the cane against the table, and his face in its usual contained expression, and when he spoke his voice was steady and deliberate and carried no particular emotion, which made it considerably more convincing than emotion would have. "I know my own signature," he said. "I have made the letter G the same way since I was 12 years old. The G on this document is not mine. You can compare it to anything I've signed at this office over the past 15 years. Reardon looked at the document. Then he looked at Ward. Ward was looking at the table. Callum, Reardon said. His voice had changed slightly. Ward didn't say anything for a moment. His heavy hands were flat on the table, and he was looking at them. Callum, Reardon said again, quieter. The signature was presented to me as executed, Ward said. His voice was muffled, the voice of a man speaking through something uncomfortable. I processed the associated documentation as presented. He stopped. By whom? Reardon said. A long silence. Boone's office provided the documents, Ward said, with instructions to process them as standard. Another stop. I had concerns about the signature. I raised them with, I was told it was fine, that Gideon had signed it prior to the injury and it was being filed late due to the circumstances. That's a lie, Gideon said, not with anger, with the flat, matter-of-fact quality of a man stating a known thing. I did not sign this document before the injury or after it, Boone said sharply. Gideon, I understand you've been influenced. Don't, Gideon said. The single word had a quality that stopped the room. Not loud, not theatrical, just completely without give. Elena placed the water rights filing on the table. This is a water rights amendment filed 38 months ago with what purports to be Mr. Cross's signature, notarized by a notary whose license had been expired for 6 months at the date of filing. The filing is therefore invalid, and the signature, again, is not Mr. Cross's. She looked at Reardon. We have 3 documents bearing forged signatures. We have 18 months of account discrepancies consistent with systematic theft. We have incorporation records showing a landholding entity created in Silas Boone's brother-in-law's name 3 weeks before the accident that incapacitated Mr. Cross, and during which period these documents were filed. And we have a witness statement. She placed Walt's statement on the table. This is a signed and witnessed account from Walter Greer, who has been employed on the Cross Ranch for 15 years, regarding what he observed on the day of Mr. Cross's accident, including a figure on the fence line of the south pasture, in the area from which Mr. Cross's horse was most likely disturbed. Boone said, a ranch hand's statement about something he thought he saw is exactly what it is, Elena said. One piece of a larger picture. It doesn't stand alone. None of this stands alone. She looked at the table, at the documents laid out in their order. But together it tells a story, and the story is consistent across every piece of it. And that story is that Silas Boone has been defrauding this ranch for years, and that the accident that incapacitated Gideon Cross was not an accident. The room was very quiet. Boone's face had not collapsed. She had not expected it to. He was not a man whose face collapsed easily, but something had shifted in it. The pleasantness had thinned. Underneath it was something else, the look of a man recalculating very rapidly. This is an extraordinary set of claims, he said, from a woman with a documented history of financial desperation who stands to benefit from her husband's property being unencumbered, who has been in this county for less than 3 months. The door opened. Elena hadn't planned this. Voss hadn't planned it. It was not in any version of the afternoon strategy she had thought through. But the door opened and Gideon Cross stood up from his chair, and he placed both hands flat on the table surface for a moment. And then he straightened, and he stepped away from the table, and he walked. With the cane in his left hand, yes, but with his weight carried through both legs, with a gait that was imperfect and slow and unambiguously his own, to the door to close it. He walked back. He stood. Silas Boone was looking at him with an expression that was, for the first time in Elena's observation of the man, genuinely uncontrolled. Not fear, not guilt. More elemental than that. The look of someone who has built a version of reality that requires another person to be helpless, and has just seen that person stand up. Reardon was looking at Gideon too. So was Garrett. Ward had looked up from the table. My wife has presented what we've found, Gideon said. He was standing without holding anything. His left leg shook slightly, the tremor visible if you were watching for it, which Elena was. He did not move to conceal it. I'd like to add one thing. I know Silas Boone. I have known him since my father was alive. I know the way he moved through this county, the way he offered help, and then made you dependent on the help. The way he positioned himself at the center of every transaction until you couldn't see around him. He paused. I let him do that. I let him into my accounts and I trusted him when I was in pain, and I signed things I didn't understand, and I will carry that. But I did not sign those documents. He looked directly at Boone. And I did not fall off that horse by accident. Boone said, Gideon, I have been nothing but a friend to you. Sheriff, Gideon said, still looking at Boone. Reardon said, Yeah. I would like to make a formal complaint. Reardon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at Ward, who was looking at his hands. He looked at Boone. Silas, Reardon said, I think you should stop talking. Boone's mouth closed. Something happened in his face, a long, slow readjustment, like a landscape changing after something structural had given way. He looked at the documents. He looked at Ward, who would not look back at him. He looked at Reardon, whose expression was the careful, settled look of a man who had made a decision. He looked at Elena last. She met his eyes. He had expected her to look away. She could see it, the slight widening that came when something he expected didn't happen. She held his gaze without heat, without triumph, without anything that could be read as performance. She simply looked at him the way she had looked at the ledger numbers, the way she looked at anything she needed to see clearly. He looked away first. Reardon said, Voss, leave those documents with me, all of them. Copies, Voss said. I'll leave certified copies. The originals stay with my clients pending formal proceedings. A pause. Agreed. Reardon stood. He was a deliberate man, not a fast one, and he looked at the room for a moment before he spoke again. Mr. Boone, I'm going to ask you to come with me. Garrett, I'll need you to stay and take a record of what's been presented. Ward. He stopped. Ward, we'll talk after. Ward nodded without looking up. Boone stood. He adjusted his coat with the automatic movements of a man whose hands knew what to do when the rest of him wasn't sure. He was still composed in the surface way, the way of a man with decades of practice at surface composure. But it was only surface. Elena could see through it now the way she'd seen through the ledger adjustments, the shape of a thing that had been made to look like something else for so long that it had almost forgotten what it actually was. He walked to the door. At the threshold he stopped, and he looked back, and his eyes went to Gideon. He said nothing. There was nothing, Elena thought, that he could have said that the room would have received. He left. Reardon followed. The door closed. In the quiet that followed, Elena sat down. Her legs had been steady through all of it. She had made certain of that. And now that the room had emptied of most of its charge, they informed her that they were tired and that she should probably sit. She sat. She put her hands on the table and looked at them and took a breath that was slightly longer than her usual breath. Gideon lowered himself back into his chair beside her. She heard the cane against the table leg. She heard his breath, which was also longer than usual. All right, Garrett said from across the table. He was looking at them with a careful, slightly stunned expression. Someone's going to need to explain to me how I ended up in this meeting. We'll start from the beginning, Voss said, and opened his satchel again. Elena looked at the window. Outside, the main street of Callaway Flats went about its Thursday afternoon. Wagons, the sound of someone's horse, the ordinary sounds of a town that had not yet heard what had happened in this room and would, by evening, hear nothing else. She felt Gideon's hand, briefly, on the table next to hers. Not covering it, just close. The way you move towards something you'd decided to be near. She turned back to the room. There was still work to do. The ride back to the ranch that evening was quiet, in the way that follows something large. Not empty, but full of things that hadn't yet found their shape in words. Voss drove his own buggy back toward the inn where he was staying, and Elena and Gideon rode together in the wagon with Dix at the reins, and the sun was going down over the flatland in the particular way it did in autumn out here, turning everything briefly gold before the dark came in. Gideon sat beside her with the cane between his knees and his eyes on the road ahead, and she sat beside him with her hands in her lap, and neither of them said anything for a long time, which was all right. They had gotten reasonably good, over the past 10 weeks, at the kind of silence that didn't require filling. It was Dix who spoke first, which was unusual enough that they both turned to look at him. Did it go the way you needed? He said. He was watching the road, not them. Yes, Elena said. Dix nodded once. He was quiet for another mile. Then, Walt's going to want to hear about it. He'll hear, Gideon said. He's been worried, Dix said, since he signed the statement. He didn't say so, but I could tell. I know, Gideon said. Tell him I want to talk to him tonight. Dix nodded again and didn't say anything else, and the wagon rolled on through the cooling evening, and the ranch appeared ahead in the dusk the way it always did. Gradually, first the outline of the barn, then the main house, then the detail of the porch and the fence, and the soft light in the kitchen window that meant the stove was still going from the morning. Elena looked at it the way she had looked at it the first time she'd arrived, from the wagon bed with her 2 trunks, trying to read what kind of place it was. She knew what kind of place it was now. She knew its sounds at night, and which floorboard in the hall creaked, and that the east window let in a draft in the early morning, and that the soil in the kitchen garden was better on the left side than the right. She knew the shape of its debt and the history of its pastures and what it had been before the past year had worn it down. She knew it was worth saving. She had known that for a while. She was only now letting herself feel the full weight of how much she meant it. Voss came back to the ranch 2 days later with the preliminary findings from the county office, which confirmed what they had expected and several things they hadn't. Ward had cooperated. This was not entirely a surprise, and Elena had said as much to Gideon when she'd watched Ward's face in that meeting room, but the extent of his cooperation was more than she had anticipated. He had provided a written account of every transaction he had processed on Boone's instruction that he had known or suspected to be improper. The list was long. It covered not just the cross accounts, but 2 other properties in the county, a smaller ranch to the north and a parcel of farmland to the east of town, that had been subjected to similar treatment over several years. Ward's account described Boone's method with the precision of a man who had watched it up close for long enough to understand its architecture. The picture that emerged was not of a man who had made opportunistic choices. It was of a man who had developed a system, patient, methodical, exploiting the specific vulnerability of isolated landowners who trusted a neighbor of standing and found themselves slowly in a position they couldn't see clearly until it was very advanced. Gideon had not been his only target. He had simply been the largest. Reginald Cutter, Boone's brother-in-law, had surrendered the Palliser land and cattle documents to the county within 48 hours of the meeting, through his own attorney. Elena took this to mean that Cutter had been waiting for the structure to collapse and had his exit prepared. She didn't feel particular sympathy for him, but she understood the calculation. He was a small man in a large man's scheme, which didn't make him innocent but made him useful in the aftermath. The forged signatures were referred to a state authority for formal criminal proceedings. Voss explained to Gideon that this meant a longer timeline, months possibly, before anything was resolved in court. Elena had expected this. She had long since stopped waiting for any version of justice that arrived quickly and complete. The version that was real arrived in pieces, at the inconvenient pace of institutions, and you accepted it because it was the version that existed. What mattered in the near term was the injunctions Voss had filed. Boone's access to any cross-ranch accounts was formally suspended. The Palliser transfer of the Eastern Range rights was invalidated, pending the criminal investigation. The Water Rights Amendment was voided on the grounds of the expired notarization. The land, all of it, was unambiguously and solely Gideon Cross's again. Voss delivered all of this at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with his customary efficiency, and when he was done, he accepted coffee and was briefly, quietly human about it, in a way he hadn't been in his professional mode. "I've been doing this 30 years, he said. Cases like this one don't always end the way this one has ended. I want you to know that. You built something I could work with. Most people in your position don't." "Most people in our position didn't have what we had," Elena said. Voss looked at her. "What's that?" he said. "Time," she said, "and each other." He looked at Gideon, then back at her, and something in his old timber face shifted slightly in the direction of something warmer than professional approval. He drank his coffee and didn't editorialize further, which she respected. Woke. Callaway Flats processed what had happened the way small towns processed things, unevenly, with pockets of resistance and pockets of genuine reckoning, and a general movement over days and weeks, toward the new version of events because the new version was supported by documents and the old version was not. There were people who found ways to maintain their previous position, who said Boone had been a good man pushed to bad choices by financial pressure, who said you couldn't know the whole story, who said Elena had come in from outside and stirred things up and the community would have handled it eventually on its own. She heard these versions and noted them and did not argue with them, because arguing with people who had decided what they wanted to believe was not an efficient use of the finite time available in any given day. There were more people who came around. Some of them came around because the evidence was too clear to dispute. Some came around because their own sense of themselves required them to, because they'd had their own small suspicions about Boone over the years and hadn't acted on them and now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of someone who'd had information and stayed quiet. Elena was more patient with these people than she might have been. She knew something about the particular cost of staying quiet about a thing you couldn't yet prove. She didn't hold it against them, mostly. Mrs. Platt came to the ranch on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the county office meeting. She brought a jar of preserves and a manner that was somewhere between apologetic and determined, the look of a woman who had something to say and had decided to say it and was going to get through it without making it overly sentimental. I know I wasn't... She stopped on the porch, jar in hand. After Thomas, I wasn't as much of a friend to you as I might have been. You told me to be practical, Elena said, which was the most useful thing anyone said to me in those weeks. That's generous. It's accurate, Elena said. Come in. Mrs. Platt came in. She stayed 2 hours and talked about Boone, things she had noticed over years that she hadn't connected. Small things, the way he'd spoken about certain properties, the way his influence had extended without anyone marking the specific moment it had become too much. She wasn't confessing. She was processing, the way people did when the shape of something they'd been living inside became visible only after they'd stepped outside it. Elena listened and said what was true and didn't perform forgiveness she didn't particularly need to give, because Mrs. Platt hadn't wronged her specifically, just been human in the ordinary way humans were. Incomplete and imperfect and not always equal to the moment. After she left, Gideon came in from the yard and looked at the table where the preserves jar sat. Mrs. Platt, Elena said. I figured, he said. He looked at the jar for a moment. Is it going to be like this for a while? People coming around? Probably, she said. He sat down. He moved without the cane most of the time now inside the house. The leg was still wrong, still unreliable on difficult terrain, and worse on bad days, and she didn't expect that to change entirely. The damage was what it was. But he had recovered something that was not about the leg specifically, something about the way he occupied his own body, the decision to be in it rather than merely managing it. That was what the work had built, more than the physical improvement. The physical improvement was real, and it mattered, and she was proud of it, in the way she was proud of things she'd actually done. But the other things was what she thought about when she thought about those morning sessions on the porch. The look on his face the morning he walked across the yard without the cane. Not triumph. Something older and quieter than that. You don't have to be part of all of it, she said. The people coming around. I can manage most of it. I know you can, he said. That's not... He paused, in the way he paused when the words were coming out less exact than he wanted them. I want to be part of it. That's what I'm saying, badly. She looked at him. All right, she said. The formal proceedings against Boone took 4 months. Elena knew they were happening in the background the way you knew about weather in a distant county. Present and consequential, but not the daily fact of life. Voss handled it. He wrote letters and she wrote back, and occasionally something required her signature, and she provided it. Gideon made one trip to the county seat to give a formal deposition, which he came back from quieter than usual for 2 days, then steadier. Ward received a formal censure from the banking authority and was removed from his position. He did not contest it, which Voss said was the result of whatever deal had been made in exchange for his cooperation. Cutter paid a civil settlement and disappeared from the county's records with the particular efficiency of a man who had always planned for this contingency. Boone faced criminal charges, fraud, forgery, and the harder charge of criminal endangerment relating to the accident, which the state authority had picked up based on the cumulative evidence and Walt's statement and the physical record of the injury's angle and cause. Elena heard the outcome from Voss by letter on a cold morning in February. She read it at the kitchen table and set it down and looked at the window for a while. He was convicted on the fraud and forgery charges. The endangerment charge, the one that came closest to naming what had been done to Gideon on that day in the South pasture, resulted in a lesser finding than she had hoped for, because the evidence, however coherent in pattern, remained circumstantial in its most specific point. She had known this was possible. Voss had told her it was possible. It still sat in her chest with a particular heaviness for a few hours, the weight of justice that was real and incomplete at the same time. She told Gideon that evening. He sat with it for a long time, longer than she waited out most of his silences. She let him have it. "It's enough," he said finally. "Is it?" she said. "It has to be," he said. "That's what enough means. Not that it's everything, that it's what there is and you decide to move with it." He looked at his hands on the table. "The ranch is mine. The accounts are clean. He's not going to walk into another man's property and do what he did to mine." He paused. "That's enough." She nodded. She thought he was right, and she thought it cost him something to be right about it. And both of those things were true simultaneously, which was how most true things worked. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "You're disappointed." "A little," she said, because he deserved honesty more than comfort. "I wanted the full thing." "I know," he said. "So did I." They sat with that for a while, and the kitchen was warm and outside the February dark was complete, and the fire needed another log, and eventually Gideon got up and put another log on the fire and came back to the table, and they talked about the eastern pasture and what needed to happen in spring, and the conversation moved forward the way conversations did when the people having them had decided to keep going. Spring came in slowly that year, the way it sometimes did in that part of the territory, reluctant, with setbacks, cold snaps that arrived after you'd started to trust the warmth. The land around the ranch began to show green in patches, and then more broadly, and the horses moved differently in it, and Dick started whistling again, which he had stopped doing in the worst weeks of the autumn, and which Elena had not noticed the absence of until the presence returned. Walt's sister's husband lost his position at the mill when Boone's holdings were liquidated in the aftermath of the proceedings. Elena had thought about this, had thought about it before the county office meeting, had weighed it as one of the costs of what she was doing. She had not turned back because of it, but she had not pretended the cost wasn't there. She asked Walt, in the spring, how his sister was managing. "She's all right," Walt said. He was mending a fence post and didn't look up from it. "Her husband found work at the Granger mill in Crestview. They moved." He paused. "She was glad, actually. Didn't like the county anyway." Elena nodded. "I'm glad they're all right." Walt looked at her sideways, briefly, the way he sometimes looked at her when he was checking something. "You worried about that, didn't you?" "Yes," she said. "You could have told me," he said. "Wouldn't have changed anything. But you could have." I know," she said. "I didn't want to put it on you." He went back to the fence post. "You put things on yourself that you don't need to," he said, not unkindly. "It's a habit." She thought about this for the rest of the afternoon. She thought he was probably right. She had spent so long being the person who held things together without showing the seams that she had made the holding together itself into a form of isolation. You could be capable and lonely at the same time. She had been both for long enough that she'd almost stopped being able to tell them apart. The difference, in the past months, was that she had people now who would hold things with her if she let them. Walt, with his steady, unhurried presence and his habit of saying exactly what he meant. Dix with his uncomplicated loyalty and his whistling. Voss, in his professional way. Mrs. Platt, in her imperfect way. Gideon, in the way that was most important and most complicated and most real. She was still learning to let people in. It did not come naturally, and it was not graceful, and she made it harder than it needed to be sometimes. But she was learning. Well, on an afternoon in April, she was in the kitchen garden, the left side where the soil was better, planting the first of the season's seeds when she heard footsteps behind her that she recognized by sound and rhythm, the way you learn to recognize a person's specific way of moving through the world. She didn't look up immediately. She was pressing a seed into the earth with her thumb, feeling the give of the soil, concentrating on the spacing. Gideon came and stood beside her. Not behind, beside. He crouched down. It still cost him something to crouch, The leg didn't love the angle, but he managed it, and looked at the row she was planting. "What's this one?" he said. "Carrots," she said. "And further along, beans. And I want to try squash on the right side this year, even if the soil's worse there, because I think it needs something heavier rooted in it." "Probably right," he said. He picked up a seed from the small pile she had in the fold of her apron and turned it between his fingers. He had large hands. She had noticed this early, the hands of a man who had worked his own land for 20 years, with calluses in specific places that told you which work he'd done most. "I was thinking about the east pasture," he said. "What about it?" "It's been underused since the rights business. I want to put more cattle on it. But to do that properly, I need to fence the creek boundary differently." He paused. "It's going to cost something we don't quite have yet." "How much and when?" she said. "By autumn. And—" He named a figure that was not small but was not impossible. She thought about the accounts as she knew them now. Clean, accurately kept, the debt serviced properly for the first time in years with the corrected payment arrangements Voss had restructured. "We can do it," she said. "We'll need to defer the barn repairs until spring of next year." "That's what I thought," he said. "I wanted to check with you." He said it simply, without any indication that checking with her was remarkable, and it was the simplicity of it that got her, a little. The casualness of an equal. Not performing partnership, just doing it. "Then do the fence," she said. She deshusipet. He stood slowly with the particular sequence of movements she knew so well. The leg, the balance, the careful return to upright. He stood beside her in the April light, looking at the garden and then at the ranch beyond it, at the land that had come back to him after a year of it being taken in pieces by someone who had counted on him staying down. "I want to say something," he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at the land, not at her, which was how he did things when they were difficult. He needed somewhere else to direct his eyes so the words could come out right. "When I set up the arrangement with Fry," he said, "I told myself I needed practical help. I told myself that was all I was capable of asking for, given the situation, the leg and the accounts, and all of it." He paused. "I don't think I knew what I was asking for. I don't think I knew that practical was going to mean what it meant." He finally looked at her. "What I mean is that I didn't know that it was possible for someone to be in my house, and actually—" He stopped, started again. "I had gotten used to being managed, people doing things for me out of pity or obligation or because it served them somehow. I had stopped being able to feel the difference between that and something genuine. I thought they were probably the same thing." She was very still. "I know the difference now," he said, "and I wanted to say that, because you deserve to hear it said." She looked at him, at the face she knew well now, the weathered lines, the gray at his temples, the eyes that had been careful and closed when she'd first seen them, and were something more open than that now. Not transformed, not remade, just more available than before, the way a room feels different when the windows have been opened after a long winter. "I know," she said. "I could tell." "I figured you could," he said. "You can tell most things." "Not everything," she said. "More than most," he said. She looked back at the garden, at the row of pressed earth where the carrots would come up in their own time, unhurried, not caring about any of this. She thought about Thomas, not with the grief that had been sharp 6 months ago, but with the duller, more honest grief that remained after the sharp part. The acknowledgement that a life had been imperfect and real and genuinely hers and was over, and that something else had become genuinely hers now, which did not cancel the first thing but existed alongside it, the way most true things existed alongside each other. She thought about the woman who had stood in Mrs. Platt's kitchen with $47 and signed her name to an arrangement she hadn't wanted, and she thought about what that woman would have said if you'd told her what the next 10 months held. She thought she probably would have believed the bad parts and not the good ones, because that was how you survived difficulty, by not expecting the good parts, by assuming the continuation of what you already knew. She had been wrong. She was glad she had been wrong. "I should finish the row," she said. "I'll help," Gideon said. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. He lowered himself to crouch beside her again, with less difficulty than last time, and picked up a seed from her apron fold and pressed it into the earth with his thumb, spacing it where the next one needed to go. "Tell me if the spacing's wrong." She looked at it. "It's right," she said. They worked down the row together in the April light, and the ranch sat around them in its ongoing imperfect state. The barn that needed work next year, the east pasture waiting for its fence, the kitchen window that still let in a draft, the porch board that was still soft, the things that weren't fixed and the things that were, and the ordinary accumulation of a place that people were actually living in. This is what she had learned, Elena thought, in 10 months on the Cross Ranch. Not the things she would have predicted. She had thought she was going to learn survival. She had come there for survival, and she had not been wrong about needing it. But survival turned out to be the smallest of what the place had offered. What she had actually learned was something about the specific value of being seen by another person. Not idealized, not managed, not handled with the particular careful distance people kept from women in difficult circumstances. Just seen for what she could do and what she actually was and what she was still figuring out. She had learned that trust was not a thing that arrived. It was a thing that accumulated, the way the discrepancies in the ledger had accumulated. Slowly, invisibly, until one day it was undeniably there and had been there for some time. She had learned that the people a community dismissed as broken were often the people who understood the most about what held things together, because they had watched the structure from the underside, from the position of someone who couldn't take it for granted. Gideon had built this ranch from the underside of a year's worth of pain and deliberate isolation. She had built this marriage from the underside of grief and $47 and a body that the world had never quite made room for. Neither of them had come to this place from strength. They had come to it from the edge. That, she thought, was not a weakness in what they'd built. It was the reason it was real. She pressed the last seed into the earth and straightened up, and Gideon straightened beside her, and they stood in the garden in the warmth of the April afternoon, looking at the row of pressed earth that didn't look like anything yet, and would, in time, become something worth having. "Good," she said. "Yes," Gideon said. They walked back to the house together, and the ranch went on around them, and the spring kept coming in, slow and imperfect and entirely itself, the way all good things eventually did.